Let me start with the simple question. When you open an investment account at a bank, how do you actually trust the people involved? Do you actually trust the person scanning your documents? Trust the analyst running the background checks? Do you trust the manager who approves the account? Or do you trust the system they're operating inside? Because none of those people are trusted on day one just because they're smart. They're trusted because of the training they get, the separation of duties, audit trails, compliance rules, and oversight. Today, we're going to make the case that AI agents should be trusted in exactly the same way as a system, not because they're intelligent, but because they are governed. And once you see that, the question of AI trust becomes a lot less scary and a lot more practical. I'm John Miller, coming to you from San Francisco.
I'm Eric Broda, coming to you from Toronto, Canada.
And welcome to the Agentic Mesh podcast. So, Eric, it's great to be recording again. Act one of our podcast, we're going to do a 3-act. It starts with, what do we mean by trust? And let's just start with the definition of trust. When we say trust in AI, what are people usually reading into it? Are they thinking about the intelligence of the agent, the autonomy of the agent, or the risk that the agents propose? Let's define trust.
Yeah, sure. I think there's probably two things, and I'm going to kind of link back to what you did in our open, but there's two facets to this. One is there's trust in an agent, and then there's trust in the system that the agent runs in. So let's start with the first one. And this is a very simple definition. I know we're going to go into a lot more detail. Simplistically, an agent is trustworthy if you know its purpose, it follows its purpose, and it adheres to the guidelines or policies that are established for it. There's trust in the agent ecosystem when you know that the agents can be certified to do just what I just mentioned, and that there's a governance life cycle that allows that process to be managed. So that's a relatively simple, high-level definition, John. Where's your head at?
Well, yeah. And I think what we're saying is that if you think about how systems are designed to trust people, that's a good place to start. And so, what I like about this framing is that it allows us to take a highly regulated industry where people make mistakes all the time. And there's been years of practice in governing something like a bank account open because we've seen what can go wrong. And I think when we think about agents as individual processes, we can think of them as individual people. Without, I hate to anthropomorphize, but if you think about the boundaries around that person, and if you assign that same responsibility to an agent, this is a systemic way of thinking about it. And that's what I like about our definition of trust and how we're thinking about governance.
Yeah, I think the analogy to people is very appropriate, and as you highlighted, the analogy perhaps breaks down. But let me just start off with this: is if I think about human workflow, bank account open is a very simple example because I think most people understand it. When you have that bank account open process, there's obviously some technology involved, but let's put that aside for a second. There's somebody that you're talking to that will receive your requests. Then if you have anything outside of a very simple checking account, perhaps an investment account or foreign currency, there's a bunch of people behind the scenes that would actually be involved. So you're assuming that these people are all trusted. They are in the same organization. They're allowed to actually access this information. The second thing is you're assuming that the process, the standard operating procedures, the policies, the regulations are actually in place, and that these people have been trained to understand what they are. They hence can follow them on a regular basis, and there's some checks and balances that occasionally audit or check that things are actually working properly. So when you think about the things in a bank account open, the analogy is roughly the same for agents, where the agent will have a purpose policy. Presumably, it has the skills or the training to do its work. It works within where we call it a workflow on the human side. There's probably an agent process that they follow or some task planning. And presumably there's some policies and procedures that explain how that's supposed to work, and that the agents actually are codified to adhere to that. And then there's some background capability that audits them, ensures compliance. So the analogy actually, at least for now, I think, is quite appropriate and actually gives us a nice little foundation, I suppose, upon how to look at agents and the systems they work in.
Yeah, and what I think that's really exciting about this is not just the analogy, but I think it's about sharing with other AI engineers how to design trusted system. And if we use regulated industries as a framework that human beings
Mhm.
trust, like ourselves, then we can build systems that other humans will trust with a bunch of agents doing high value tasks, in some cases, low value tasks like scanning a document. But if we're going to trust the agents, we need to use systems of control or governance that we've used before, and then we monitor it. And that's, I think, one of the big observations. And so people that are thinking about building agentic systems should probably talk to their regulated industry friend, right? If you're a banker who's very familiar with the audit process inside a bank, you know that the first line of defense is the business unit needs to be following the rules and there's oversight. Now, in a bank, you don't just get away with that. You actually have a second line of defense, which is this. As we get into the second act, we'll talk more about governance structures. But I think that is the way to think about trust, is that we're not trusting these agents because they're brilliant. In the same way, we don't trust bankers because they're brilliant. We trust them because they're governed, and we've got regulation and authorities that oversee their operations. And so in the second act, when we talk about governance practices, I think it goes hand in hand with this idea of trust.
Yeah, absolutely. Is it a good time to start our second deck, as you're calling it? Let's talk about some really simple ones that I think most people, at least in banking, will probably recognize. And in some cases, maybe as part of the common vernacular. I don't know. But coming from banking and insurance, I know these things. But anyway, there's SOX compliance, for example, which has a whole bunch of different rules and regulations that all financial institutions need to adhere to. And really, the bottom line is they want to be able to ensure that we can observe what the banks are doing, and that we can actually, once observe them, we can actually govern them, as you mentioned. There's PII, which governs access to personally identifiable information. In Europe, you have GDPR, which governs privacy of data, which obviously the agents, AI, will have to consume. So these are some of the common rules, very high level rules and regulations that all financial institutions need to adhere to. There's a second level, obviously. There's lots of levels, but there's a second most obvious one that says, how do I actually go about implementing those within a bank? Now, what that really means is I have HR rules and regulations that govern who can actually access or look at data. Some data you can see and some data you can't. If you do not need to know, then you probably don't have access to that data. So there's lots of rules and regulations, all embodied in what are typically called standard operating procedures that help govern how people actually do the work. So there's external rules, the laws of the land, if you will, and then there's ones that are inside the enterprise, the laws of the firm, if you will, that people need to actually adhere to, and the organizations that house those people need to actually adhere to. So there's a lot of analogs that we actually see today, that provide the framework for, in this case, banking. But there's other analogies that we may want to talk about. Underwriters Lab, the Canadian Standards Association, that govern how products are actually governed. Is that something, John? What do you want to start in that?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking back to Sarbanes-Oxley. Now, a lot of people don't know that that was an important era for public companies, right? When it was disclosed that public companies in the early aughts were misreporting or being loose with their financial reporting. And so the Sarbanes-Oxley regulations forced every company that had a financial reporting process, which is every public company, to describe in detail what are the steps that go into, this person takes this data and puts it in a spreadsheet, creates a report, all of these steps. And obviously it's more complicated than that. But for every process and person that's involved in the creation of a financial report, you needed to specify the operating procedures as well as where are the control points where we're going to observe what that person is doing and have somebody audit that whatever they said they did was done. And so attesting to the fact that you're doing the right thing is one thing, but actually observing by reviewing a control point is how Sarbanes-Oxley was implemented. One of the things about it when we think about agents is that, we're not listening to agents talk, but maybe we should. Because what we're going to find is that agents, when they make a decision or execute a step in a process, they're going to have to write down what they did in what we know is an immutable log that can be verified by a human or another trusted agent to say that that agent at that time for this process made this decision. And I think making it feel really simple to audit agents, I think is going to be the way we have a breakthrough with understanding how to trust and govern these things. And for those of us who've been in consulting and banking and regulated industries, and I don't want to leave all the other industries out, but we know a lot about how to separate the duties, and that's even a term in financial service, so that we can audit a specific individual for taking a specific action. And if we translate that into capabilities for an agent ecosystem, I think we immediately say, I can use that same analogy of, in this case, Sarbanes-Oxley, to build in the controls, the transparency, so that we can actually see what the agent did, and then hopefully trust it once we've seen what it wrote down.
Yeah, well, the nice thing about that analogy, John, and I think there's a common theme that you see as we talk about these things is we're not reinventing the wheel. There's decades of practice that it'd be remiss if we didn't actually leverage those decades of practice. So there's another example that we've talked about before around compliance. And this one's been around much, much longer than Sarbanes-Oxley or SOX. It's product certification. In the United States, it's done by Underwriters Laboratory. In Canada, it's done by the Canadian Standards Association. I'm sure there's bodies in Europe and Asia that do very, very similar things. And they have one single purpose. I mean, I'm definitely not trivializing, but I'm going to simplify it a bit, is they want to make sure that the products that have the UL logo, the underwriter's logo, or the CSA logo, do what they're supposed to be doing. They meet expectations. They fulfill their purpose and meet the rules and regulations and policies that are in place for those. Now, here's the most interesting thing about it is this has been going on for decades. If I'm not mistaken, Underwriters Lab has been around for a long, long, long time.
Well, because the origin was to guarantee that this new technology called electricity, it was safe enough that we could put it on lamp poles. And then eventually we're going to bring electricity into the house. How do we prevent the house from burning down? How do we make sure that when you plug it into the wall, whatever, if you're in the US, 120 volts or 240 if you're in the UK, at the voltage and and what's the other one I'm thinking of?
The current or the ampere, the
Yeah.
current and the amperage.
Yeah. So Underwriters Labs came at an important time when we needed to say that electricity was safe. And if we believe agents, and we do, are going to be as pervasive and in our homes controlling things, I think the Underwriters Labs view of compliance to a set of standards for usage of electricity in the home, it's a great one. And so we know it's at least 100 years old.
Yeah. Well, here's the interesting thing about it is there's a lot of things that go into making that work. If you think about it, it's not just, the electricity outlet, it's the toaster that if you pick it up, you look at it, you see the Underwriters Lab or CSA here in Canada. but just about any electronic component and a wide variety of industrial components now have that logo associated with them. Now, here's the interesting thing about it, and I think this is the lesson learned, if you will, is there's literally millions of products that these folks govern or certify. There's no way that an individual can do this, or even one organization can do this without delegating responsibility to the experts in the field or groups that have been designated or accredited in the field. What that really means is if we believe the pundits or some of the folks that probably know a lot about this. Andy Jassy says there's going to be a billion agents around in every firm. Satya Nadella says SaaS is going away and replaced with agents. Even if they're wrong, it's not a billion. Maybe it's a million. Maybe it's 100,000. That is the scope of governance and the scope of certifying an agent and what it can do and can't do, and is it doing it properly, is a federated exercise if you really think about it. So the lessons learned from Underwriters Lab, the reason your toaster doesn't burn your house down and the reason agents won't metaphorically burn your data center down is because there's a process, a federated process, that we would strongly suggest we look at carefully and adopt, that helps manage large federated ecosystems.
Yeah. And what I love about it is that it's a centralized rule, but it's federated in how it's implemented and audited and certification is granted. And I think that's exactly right. That's the way we need to think about it. So, in asking the age old question, is there anything that feels genuinely new about agents, or is just reusing old ideas enough? What do you
Well,
think?
yeah, I don't think they're identical to people or even Underwriters Lab, but they rhyme, as they say. There's a lot of similarities between the two. So we have a framework, a 7-layer framework, if you will, that lets you look at trust at the lowest level in the agents and then at the highest level in the agent ecosystem. And this may take a little bit of a time, so feel free to interrupt me with some questions along the way, John. And this is covered in the Agentic Mesh book, but let me see if I can bring it to life. And where I can draw analogies to people or otherwise, I'll try and do that. So the first fundamental or foundational level is you need to have identity, just like people. If I'm an employee in a bank and I'm responsible for opening your bank account, as a person who's asking them to do the work, I want to make sure that they're not just a person off the street, rather they're an employee of the organization. They have an
Right. So,
identity.
yeah, so HR has actually said, we're going to hire this person, we're going to teach them the rules, they're going to be allowed to operate in the bank. They've got whatever training they need to follow the rules and do it well. And so that's the first gate is the HR
Yeah,
identity gate. Yeah.
you got it. So in security terminology, identity and authentication. Second one is, now that I'm an employee or an agent in the ecosystem, I need to be given permissions or a role that allows me to access the tools of my trade, or the data that I may actually need to do it. So layer 2 is about access control or authorization, as they say in the security practice. Once I have identity and authorization, now I need to actually frame what we talked about at the starting point, which is the purpose and the policies. What is myself as an agent, just like an employee? I have a role and I know what I need to do. What is my agent's purpose? And what are the rules, the policies, regulations that I need to follow as an agent to do my work? Now, once I have that and I start to actually do some work, I need to be able to actually understand how they do their task planning, just like a real person. A real person would follow a particular workflow. An agent may not have that exact same workflow, but maybe it has access to standard operating procedures. So we need to be able to understand that it's actually doing its work in a proper way, but also an explainable way. And that's one of the things that when somebody opens your bank account and you have a question about the process, they can explain what's actually going on. Where is that in the process? So task planning and explainability is layer 4. Once you have, yeah, go for it, John.
Yeah, no, so I think explainability, can we just take a quick second to define what we mean by explainability, which is slightly different than where people start to think about explainability. When they think about agents, they've often been
Yeah.
told that it's impossible to explain how a neural network made a decision. But you can explain what inputs it had. You can explain what decision it made. That's explainability. We don't ask, a banker to explain every small detail of their decision. We asked them to explain the recommendation they made and why they made that decision. I just wanted to say that, like, let's make sure people understand the difference between how we're using explainability versus explaining the model itself.
Yeah, and I think it's absolutely crucial because I think you highlighted a key point. So agents, their brain, if you will, is these large language models. The problem, and I think some of this is being addressed or at least getting better, when you issue a request to ChatGPT or another large language model, every once in a while, if depending on which model you're using, you actually get a little bit of this is what I'm doing, an explanation. You can actually see a little bit of that.
Yeah.
That is the absolute minimum that tells you what that model is doing. That is the absolute minimum. We believe explainability needs to be much more detailed. Literally, when an agent uses LLM to create a task plan, I want to see these are the 7 steps that I wanted to take. And these are the inputs that I transformed from your original request into parameters into each individual step. And then I want to know when it delegated it to a tool or another agent that actually occurred and how that agent actually did its sub work or subtask. So explainability is in its infancy stages with large language models. We believe agents have to have that next level of explainability as I just highlighted. Now, that is crucial. The fundamental thing, this is where it gets different is that capability is actually very hard to do. It's very hard to do with the current large language models because they don't give you the hooks, if you will, to actually see what they're planning and what they're actually doing. We think that's a potential. It also I'll come out a little bit more aggressively. I think that is a fundamental flaw in how they actually work. And I believe strongly that there's steps that are being taken to address that. But in order for agents to actually grow into the ecosystem that we think they can, that's one of those fundamental aspects that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. And
Now, hopefully I
especially,
answered your question.
yeah. No, that ties back to last week where we were talking about agents running in the background. We have to have visibility to and transparency to how they're operating, right? We want to trust them. We want to govern them. They need to be auditable. They need to be transparent. And I think that's the big difference from the past, is that we've never had so many things making so many decisions so fast that a human being the idea of creating a paper trail this deep for agents is astronomical. And how
Yeah.
are we going to solve reading
Well,
that?
so let me ask you a question. So here's the analogy that I've had. Everybody talks about the human in the loop. Okay. I think we need to have now transition to the human above the loop. I think that's the phrase that people are actually using. So as you highlighted, it's impossible for one person to manage, 10, let alone 20, let alone 1,000 or a million things all going at once. Rather, what we need to do is have the mechanisms, observability and traceability. Let me explain a little bit about the difference, but observability says I want to actually see in real time, if you will, what an agent is actually doing and what state it's in. The traceability says, as we know agents are talking to other agents, the traceability says, can I actually join the conversations into a unified whole? So in order for us to actually understand what agents are doing, you need observability and traceability, and that's where the human above the loop comes into place. We have to make the visibility, observability, and traceability of millions of things in this agent ecosystem a lot simpler to understand. There's a lot of work that needs to be done around observability, traceability, and lower level things like explainability, which is why layer 5 in our model, observability and traceability, is so crucial, and it requires a little bit of a resync in terms of what we're doing today.
Yeah, dude. And it reminds me of all the talks, when we were trying to teach people what is machine learning or what is deep learning back in the tens. I remember this example of personalization. So, why is machine learning so important was the question 15 years ago. And what we would say is that if there are millions or billions of decisions that needed to go into how Facebook rendered the stream or how it presented information, you couldn't get a human being to make all those decisions. You had to automate them, you had to trust them, and you had to govern them. Now, we never did that for social networks. Let's not make that same mistake for agents. We need to have complete transparency. We need to allow that to be auditable. And I think that's the big thing. The scale of the decisions and the trust we're going to need to put into these things is going to require a whole industry, I think, of being able to solve that observability and traceability aspect.
Here's the thing is compliance and certification is crucial, but it needs to be done probably differently than what most organizations do today. We need to think about how do we apply the probably over 100 years of experience that Underwriters Laboratory had and design federated processes and accredit distributed organizations that are empowered to actually weigh in on the efficacy of a particular agent. We probably need to think about the processes around attestation
Yeah.
and have maybe even third-party organizations allowed to certify whether an agent is appropriate or not. Now, that's a little further in the future, but the lessons learned from the past can be applied here. As they say, we're standing on the shoulders of giants so that we can actually look forward. And this is an example where we strongly believe that the lessons learned from the federated governance mechanisms have to be applied into the growing agent ecosystem. The last level, and then I want to ask you a question because I think this
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
as a data nerd, you're an expert in this field. But the top layer 7, the top of the model is governance and lifecycle management. It is being able to manage the previous layers in a probably automated, but in a repeatable, observable, and traceable fashion. Now, I believe that data governance has a lot to teach us about agent governance. So, John, maybe you can wax eloquently on data governance. Recognize you're arguably an expert in this field.
Well, appreciate that. I would say I'm experienced in the field. Having worked with data for 30 years, you come to the conclusion pretty early that without some level of oversight of how you're working with the data and the policies and procedures around dealing with data issues, this is the cornerstone of data governance. And yeah, I've lived through it. That was partly because of the other thing that happened in banking in 2008. We realized that the banking system could collapse. And after 2008, you saw every financial institution on the planet that was a systemically important bank, which is the language for it, require data governance to be a first class set of policies and procedures at every bank. And so, yeah, I lived through 2008, and that's when we created the role of a chief data officer. And so, yeah, I've had at least a decade or so of working with chief data officers. And I think there is a lot to learn from data governance. However, as a board member of DAMA in Los Angeles, I also know how impossibly hard it is for data governance to be implemented in a systematic and agile way. So I would not say we've learned how to do data governance at scale. I would argue that every data governance expert, though, has the requisite training to understand why it's so important to apply those same principles of governance for data to the governance of agents. So I would give you credit. I wouldn't give us credit for having figured out how to do it effectively at scale. And I think part of the problem with data governance is it's such an intellectual process. You have to understand the processes. You have to understand what you're trying to do. Is this data fit for purpose? It's so hard. These are such important questions that require a human to make those judgment calls. I think if we do this right, certification of agents can be done by trusted, certified agents themselves. And so I think the way we build trust has to start by creating agents that are trusted to supervise other agents that we're trying to create trust around. Sorry, I went into a bit of a stream of consciousness. Was there anything you wanted to add to that before we move into the final act, which is how do we grant autonomy to these agents, and what is the right amount of autonomy to grant?
For you to go to the final act.
Well, so we talked about trust, we talked about governance, and now the question is in this final act, how do we frame the discussion about autonomy and what is too much autonomy? And so, when we give humans different levels of autonomy, we do that because either it's related to risk or whether it's something we could reverse if it's something that a human didn't do right, or accountability. And so I just wonder about your thoughts around the difference between executing a task, owning an outcome, this difference between authority and autonomy. Before we get into a checklist that we want to share, what are your thoughts about any of those things I've mentioned?
Yeah, I think, I think first off, autonomy. If I think about, well, let me draw the continuum. So we have data, which is the foundation for decisions. And we have tools that help us make some of those decisions. We have BI, we have, AI, we have just now generative AI. But when we move from data to decisions and now to action, we're translating intent into execution. And that's a very, very big difference. When we have autonomous execution and we don't have the governance processes, the visibility, the observability, et cetera, in place, things can go sideways relatively quickly. Although it's not specific to agents, I think, John, maybe just tell us what happened with Waymo recently. And I think this is an example where people trusted the system, but even the smartest people may have missed a few things.
Okay, so we're talking about the event that occurred this past weekend in San Francisco, where there was a massive power outage, and about a third of the city's residents, including business owners, were without power. And across the downtown core, a lot of where the locals live, a lot of San Francisco was impacted by a power outage. And that is a failure that often happens when there's storms, that sort of thing. But the scale of the outage was pretty big. The impact to the AI system that was running or driving on the road was the part that really incensed people, because what was happening is that the driverless cars that I love, I think I've got 4,000 miles last year of Waymo travel. Like I'm fully in, but every Waymo was starting to fail because it wasn't just because it didn't understand what a blinking light was or the lights are out. It actually does know what to do. The problem was the scale of the problem. There's approximately 1,000 Waymo cars in San Francisco. When all of the stations where they go to get cleaned and recharged, and all of the infrastructure that allows teleoperators to talk to the people in the car and support them and maybe move the car to the side, all of those systems were not designed for the scale of the outage we had. And so what happened in San Francisco, and what's going to be a big deal from this point on, because we're in an environment where major power outages can happen. What happened is that the Waymos blocked all of the intersections so that emergency vehicles or people trying to get home were stuck in the roads, and there was very little you could do. And rather than have the Waymos sort of pull over to the side and just go dormant, a lot of them were stuck in the middle of intersections, and it was a disaster. I mean, we have not yet designed the systems yet to regulate these things.
And this maybe is my closing comment on this, is in past episodes, we've talked about the ecosystem allowing agents to execute at scale. And we've talked about the fact that we needed reliability at scale. If anything, what this says, and the example with Waymo is probably illustrative in many ways, and in the example of Underwriters Laboratory, a proven method of doing this, we need trust at scale. And that's one of the fundamental requirements. So it's not necessarily just about trusting the agents, but as you said right at the start, this is about trusting the agent ecosystem, the system that actually runs the agents, and we need to figure out a way to offer trust at scale if we want to see where the agent see the full benefits and realization of the agent ecosystem.
Yeah, and we'll share the basic questions you should ask about your system in the comments. But, you have to be thinking about what happens if something goes wrong. How do we undo it? Are there legal and regulatory consequences? Can we explain why the cars made the decision? Who's accountable? These are the kind of questions we have to ask of the system. Trust in AI agents isn't about believing they're smart. It's about putting them inside systems we can trust. Awesome episode.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Eric. See you next time.
Good.